Who is the scariest person you know in real life? This is my mom's story. She passed away 3 years ago, so I am sharing it for her. For a little background, my aunt lost the love of her life to a genetic heart condition that took him at just 38 years old. Fast forward 7 years, and my grandmother and all of my aunt's friends were constantly telling her to move on from Jack and meet someone new. One night, my aunt went to a bar, and it led to a whirlwind romance that, after 3 months, ended with her getting engaged. My mom and dad went to the engagement party, and when my mom met my aunt's fiancé, Harry, she immediately disliked him. Uncle Harry looked a lot like a young Robert Redford. He was the life of the party, cracking jokes, making the whole room roar with laughter. In his words, he'd never met a stranger at a checkout line. He was friendly, funny, and seemed like a good listener. Despite all that, my mom left the engagement party early because she could not fake happiness for the soon-to-be married couple. My aunt was furious and grabbed my mom's arm as she tried to leave. My mom turned around, in front of everyone at the party, and said, "If you marry that man, he's going to kill you." A little over 5 years later, my cousin, my aunt's son from her first marriage, came home from spending the night at a friend's house and found Harry pushing my aunt against the floor. My cousin grabbed his hunting rifle and fired at Harry, which ultimately cost him his life. How my aunt survived, and without serious brain damage, is beyond me. It came out, as the police talked to my cousin, that Harry had started abusing my aunt about a year into their marriage. It is crazy to think we can always spot an evil person by looking at them, but that is not always the case. Somehow, though, my mom immediately sensed that Harry was not who he pretended to be. I once had a job at a company that employed a murderer as a security guard, though, of course, this was before anyone knew he was a murderer. He seemed like a fairly nice, albeit moody, young man. While I was working there, a child in the broader community disappeared from her home one evening. By the next morning, it was all over the news. I got into work, and there he was at his post, grinning silently while his colleague explained that the missing girl was from his neighborhood. He said he had stayed up late helping police and neighbors search for her. Unfortunately, they had found no trace of the girl, and she remained missing for more than a year. I am sure you have guessed by now that this young security guard was the one responsible for abducting and causing the tragic loss of that poor child. What is more chilling is that he stashed her body in cold storage on the premises of my workplace. This gruesome fact only came to light years later, after he had left the job, when he casually confessed the crime to his girlfriend. It was later discovered that he had also murdered an older woman at least a year before being hired as a security guard at my company. He was never outwardly scary in his manner. That is what makes my memory of him so terrifying now. I was talking about this with my family last night. One of my aunt's husbands is the kind of person whose evil seems to reflect in his appearance. That guy kills the grass he stands on. He exudes so much malice. He mistreats her and used to frequently mistreat his children, until they grew up and were finally able to stand up to him. He is unkind to everyone he meets, and no one or anything is ever good enough for him, except his own relatives, who are all narcissistic, entitled people. He is a cold, mean, manipulative bully and control freak who believes cruelty is honesty, never thinks he is in the wrong, and sees himself as righteous. He maintains a facade of calmness, but if you look closely, you can tell he is like a spring waiting to snap. He resorts to threats and even violence if people call him out or tell him to stop with his bullshit. He is the kind of person dogs growl at on sight and who kills any harmony just by walking into a room. I truly hope my aunt leaves this waste of life. We have tried to help her, but she sees the good in him. He is a school director. The only explanation for how he has held on to that job is how much of an asshole he is. I grew up with a group of 5 friends, myself, 3 other boys, and a girl. We got into a lot of trouble as kids, and that followed us into our early adult lives. My best friend in the group, I'll call him S, and I dropped out of high school and moved to Florida. This wasn't too long ago, class of 2016. Anyway, to get to the point, S ended up doing 4.5 years in prison. One of the other guys in the group died in 2017, and at the time, he was dating the girl in our group, who I'll call R. When S got out, we all hoped for the best for him. He really seemed like his good old self, charismatic, fun, and light-hearted. Not long after his release, he started dating R, and they got an apartment in the city we grew up in. We all started hanging out again, getting into some trouble here and there but much more chill now that we were older. Mostly, we'd do a little coke, play cards, laugh, and reminisce about all the crazy stuff we'd done over the years. We caught S up on everything that had happened while he was locked up, like how the four of us used to trip acid all the time. I even met the girl I'm with now through hanging out with them in a college town a little north of us. We went on a few double dates, and it was a blast. It felt like the good old days, just with less trouble. But around 2.5 to 3 years after S got out, he started to show some cracks. He seemed different. If we were messing around and it started to feel like we should stop before things got out of hand, we'd all agree to call it a night. But S would always be like, "Fuck that, I don't care," about everything. S and R started fighting, and it kept escalating. She eventually filed domestic violence charges against him. They both stopped coming around as much. When they did, they seemed like themselves on the surface and would ask me how I was doing so well in my relationship with the girl I met through them. Before I get into what happened, I want to emphasize that these were really good people. They were my childhood best friends. We'd been through so much together. There was a time when S was a genuinely good person. Sure, he had some issues, we all did, but none of us were evil. I got calls from both of them after fights where one had hit the other. I kept telling them what would happen if they didn't break up and get away from each other. I even suggested mental health help. Eventually, I stopped going around because it was too hard to watch them spiral. Believe me, I tried everything I could to help them. In July of this year, I got a call from a mutual friend of ours. She told me R had been missing for 2 days. She hadn't shown up to work, and the police were looking for her. In my heart, I knew exactly what had happened. A few days later, they found her body in a dumpster by a park we used to play at as kids. They found S the same day, trying to skip town. He was convicted on all counts not too long ago. The soonest he could get out is in 31 years. During the trial, a lot of disturbing details came out. R couldn't even be identified by pictures. It was all over the news in my area. Hearing those things about people who were once my best friends, seeing their pictures on TV in that context, was unreal. Even as I type this, I can't wrap my head around it. I'm leaving out the gruesome details, but the news covered them all. The media can be brutal like that. S is the scariest person I've ever known. To this day, I can't help but replay it all in my mind. I can't believe R is gone. We had so many good memories over the years, and she didn't deserve any of it. I can't imagine the mind of someone evil enough to do what he did. I was filling in as the sole camera operator for a documentary about a high diver one day, helping out a director buddy of mine. The plan was to film her and her family assembling aid packages for Ukrainian refugees. The moment I walked in the door, I was greeted by an angry older man with these piercing, eagle-like eyes yelling at me in a heavy Russian accent, "What's your angle? What kind of story are you trying to tell about my daughter?" His daughter, the high diver, quickly calmed him down and explained what the documentary was about. He eventually backed off. After filming the sequence of them assembling the aid packages, I spoke with the father, and he warmed up to me. I've forgotten his name at this point, so let's call him Rick. Rick told me he used to live in Soviet Russia and had been a soldier before joining a contract security firm after the Soviet Union fell. He explained how there was widespread corruption and the mafia was everywhere. Goods were constantly being stolen during transport, so contract security firms like his were in high demand. Rick had managed to get in good with both the local police and the mafia, so his routes usually ran without any issues. Then he told me a story that really stuck with me. One day, Rick and his team ran into some younger mafia members who did not know who he was and tried to stick them up. At this point in the story, Rick's demeanor completely changed. It was chilling, and I realized I was in the presence of someone very capable of violence if needed. He reenacted what he said to the mafia members, and I'll paraphrase here. "I see you have a couple of handguns between the two of you. Well, 3 of us have handguns, and the other 3 have Uzis. So you can either take some money and forget you saw us, or we are going to have a problem." They took the money and left. Rick hates Putin and communism with a passion. At one point, he asked me, "When has communism ever not resulted in bloodshed?" I had no answer for him. I do not have much prowess in history. He and his wife now work tirelessly to coordinate the shipment of aid to his contacts in Poland. That dude scared the hell out of me, but I am genuinely glad people like him exist. There are so many horrible, greedy people who work tirelessly to enrich themselves at the expense of others. But then there's Rick, working just as passionately and hard to instill some good in the world. Guy who was in my friend group in high school. We were kinda the weird geeky kids, but this guy was on a totally different level. He would go cruising around and look for the little roadside memorials that people around here will put up when a loved one is killed in a car crash. Generally they consist of photos, stuffed animals, saint candles, maybe something seasonal for a holiday. This guy would check out the photos to see if the victim was a cute girl, and if so would steal the photo and add it to his collection. He had a dozen or so that he kept in his wallet, like your grandma carries around to show her friends. He knew all of these dead girls' names, personal details from obituaries, yearbooks, whatever he could find. He would talk about these girls like they were his girlfriends. I met this new girl named Jenny, we're going to get together this weekend. Sometimes he took the stuffed animals from the memorials as well, but only if he thought they had actually belonged to the girls. How could he tell, you ask? He would smell them. I still wonder how many young girls he's had chained up in a basement somewhere. The kid who used to beat me up when I was young. He was a legit psychopath who tortured animals, beat up other kids, and really went after anyone who tried to stop him. Everyone hated him. One time, we all ganged up on him and got one of the older brothers in the neighborhood to help. He actually lost that fight, and we thought things would change. No. His dad found out and beat him even worse, bad enough to put him in the hospital. This was in a quiet suburban area, too. He was just bred to be a menace. He's now a Hells Angels club leader and currently in a really bad prison. There are quite a few true crime shows and podcasts where I can hear all about just how brutal his life is now, but honestly, I think he's about as well suited for a role like that as anyone could be. I went to an engineering school with a guy-to-lady ratio of 7-to-1. It took me a year to find some fellow lady friends. One of them actually lived within walking distance, and we got along really well. She eventually introduced me to a second woman who I also befriended, but it quickly became clear that this new friend was terrifying. She was obsessed with the first friend and managed to drive a wedge between her and her husband. She even moved in right next door to them and would tell me how she would sit and watch the couple make breakfast or watch TV together. Eventually, they had to get blinds. She also destroyed my first friend's college career by accusing her of abuse and cheating. Despite having no evidence and the accusations being completely false, the professors sided with her. The scary one also had a cat but seemed to have a strange fixation on the stray cats in the neighborhood. She started feeding them to draw them to her house, conditioning them. Then she began trapping them. She claimed she was helping by taking them to a shelter to be spayed or neutered, but it turned out she was just killing them. I am not sure what happened to her. I think she went back to her home state to live with her very conservative parents. I worked on creating safety routines for staff at care homes. My job was to inspect the environment, assess what care needed to be done, and write the routines. One of the people in need of care was a man whose greatest desire was to harm women. Specifically, his dream was to take off their heads. That was all he wanted in the world, to harm as many women as possible in that way. Sticking to proper safety rules is costly and inconvenient, so a couple of months after I quit, the staff, of course, sent a young temp worker alone, without an alarm, to give this man his medication. Luckily, this young woman had trained extensively in martial arts, and her instinct to sidestep saved her from the first swing of an axe from behind the door. She managed to get the door between them and bolted. She quit immediately after. That man was terrifying, but somehow, he wasn't half as scary as his neighbor, a pyromaniac. Talking to him was like talking to an alien. He completely lacked the ability to empathize with others. It was like interacting with a very bad AI trying to mimic human interaction. Knowing he loved setting fires was unsettling enough, but it was his complete indifference to whether people died in those fires that made him even worse. He did not want to kill anyone, he simply did not care if they died, no matter how many. My ex. He was attractive and had a well-polished exterior, but he carried hidden demons. He would constantly and openly wonder what it would feel like to jump from our 4th-floor apartment. He would relate to people who had committed horrific crimes, saying, "Depression blinds you from right and wrong." At times, his eyes would be so blank and dark that it was unsettling. I remember going to a company party where a caricature artist drew him with such an evil expression, it stuck with me. He would also tell me that all his ex-girlfriends would just randomly move away without telling him, simply vanishing. He would wake up in the middle of the night screaming bloody murder and shaking. It concerned me, so I questioned him about it one evening. He came to my apartment later with an information packet about PTSD and explained that he carried many of the symptoms. He told me he had done some very, very bad things in his life. I tried to console him, saying, "We all have." Then, with a blank expression, he said, "I've done the worst thing someone could do to someone else." I knew he was talking about murder. I broke up with him a couple of weeks later. He cried, grabbed onto my legs, and yelled, "This is just like with Jessica." To this day, I still don't know what happened to Jessica, but he moved away not long after. My mother. She lived through the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, sexism in the workplace, an abusive marriage and in-laws, and finally, her lifetime of single parenthood ended in elder abuse. Some have suspected she was involved with the triad at one point. I would not be surprised. She had forewarning from a friend that Tiananmen Square was happening, with enough time to warn her colleague, who was on a business trip in Beijing directly by the square. She lived every day in fear that society would collapse and that the government would betray the people again. She trained the same paranoia and hypervigilance into her children with acts that would be considered neglect and abuse by today's standards. She had superhuman reserves of grit but was also supremely emotionally unavailable due to her PTSD. She only spoke twice about her childhood. One story she shared unprompted, in response to a TV show we were watching. The other, she saw something happen, again, on a TV show, and only remarked, "I had heard about that." I have zero doubt in my mind that she saw both of these events in person in the village she was assigned to, that they happened multiple times, and that they were alongside a slew of equally or more horrific events. After my parents split, my mother never dated or invited another man home. She spent the rest of her life in quiet desperation, driven by a compulsion to prepare for, endure, and survive the next catastrophe. I am 70% sure she loved me. Her dying was the best thing she did for me. It is complicated. She did try her best, so it is not all bad. She modeled confidence, wit, discipline, and humor, which gave me an incredible advantage in achieving self-love. I miss her every year, especially in the months leading up to February. I do not doubt myself because I am my mother's daughter. I think I might have encountered some sort of killer. I recently went on a date with a guy from my school who I met on a dating app. He seemed super sweet and charming over text, so I agreed to go out with him, especially after two friends told me they knew him from a class where he was generally a funny and likable guy. We go to a small, prestigious university, which also made me feel more confident that he would be normal. He was supposed to meet me at 6 p.m. for a picnic but texted to reschedule to 8 p.m. He ended up picking me up around 8:30. He drove me to his apartment, and although I felt uncomfortable, I agreed to go in because of everything I already knew about him. The apartment was dimly lit with just one candle and a small glowing light on the floor that barely lit the space. It was a multi-bedroom apartment, but he lived there alone, which felt even stranger. We talked and ate some food, but he seemed nervous and uneasy for most of the time. Suddenly, he shifted the conversation to our deepest, darkest secrets and asked if I'd ever seriously thought about killing someone. I said no, and then he made up a story about being in the Navy and having to bomb a ship, killing 5 people. When I didn't know how to respond, he passed it off as a joke and said he had actually thought about killing someone, his ex's current boyfriend. At this point, I was extremely uncomfortable and wanted to leave. He agreed to drive me home but said he wanted to show me something first. He pulled out a rifle and pointed it in my direction. I startled, but he stayed eerily calm and said he got it for hunting but couldn't imagine killing an animal. We left, and I made it back safely to my friend's place. Everyone I've told about the date has been shocked at how it went, and I can't shake the feeling that something was really off about him. It's creeping me out, and I feel like there's something more sinister about him than I realized. Any thoughts on this would be appreciated. I just escaped a situation I truly feel could have turned deadly. A few weeks ago, I was looking for a room to rent on an app one thought was safe, my first mistake. I found a room within my budget, and a man named Rashid was renting it. At first, he seemed like a safe guy. There was consistent texting, which I initially thought was him trying to get to know me before I moved in. Looking back, I now realize he was asking me personal details and even information about my cat and his shots. After everything that happened, I truly feel he was gathering information to use against me in some way. I have a big supply of medication for my health stored in a drawer in the room I rented. Rashid admitted he had gone through my medication and researched everything he found. He began texting me daily, calling me baby and his virtual girlfriend. I tried to correct him, but he ignored my texts and continued, sending compliments about my looks and asking invasive questions. He became insistent on buying me things, showering me with food and gifts. Despite me saying no, he ignored my refusals and continued. At first, I thought he was just being nice. He once texted me, admitting that he had an ulterior motive for renting me the room. While I was looking for housing, he was looking for a live-in girlfriend. He began calling me his temporary girlfriend, and at that point, I was terrified and began to feel the danger I was in. He would knock on my door constantly and just stand there, staring at me blankly. I was in shock and immediately reached out to my family for emergency financial help, as I had already paid rent and had no money to leave. Thankfully, they helped me, and I got the funds to move. One day, he knocked on my door and told me he was obsessed with me and could not stop thinking about me. He began texting me angrily, swearing at me, and accusing me of being rude. He repeatedly asked if I trusted him and if I thought he was harassing me. He texted me, saying his behavior was escalating, that he was struggling to control himself, and that he needed help. I saw knives in his room, which I had to pass through to get to the kitchen, and a large new storage bin big enough to fit a body. When he found out I was leaving, he kept letting my cat out and texting me to cancel the car I had rented, insisting I come back to get my cat. I called the police to help escort me while I got my things, but they took hours to arrive. I asked Rashid to bring my belongings outside while I stayed outside. At one point, he said, "What if I don't want you to leave?" He waited until my cat was the last thing left and then repeatedly asked me for a kiss, despite me explaining several times that I was not interested. To keep the peace and get my cat, I reluctantly agreed to hug him. When I finally left, I was terrified. I truly believe Rashid was planning to harm me, and I am incredibly lucky to be alive. Safe to say, I will not be renting random rooms again and will prioritize getting my own apartment in the future. One time, a lady decided that the middle of the lunch rush on a busy street was the perfect time to learn how to parallel park. I ended up stuck behind her for what felt like an eternity, almost 10 minutes, while she tried to squeeze into a parking spot big enough to fit a bus. Finally, I found an opening to get around her, and in my frustration, I flipped her off and sped past, rushing back to work because I was now late from lunch. At the exact moment I flipped her off, a huge F-250 truck was driving in the opposite direction. In my rearview mirror, I noticed it make a sudden U-turn, but I didn't think much of it and kept going. It was a warm day, so I had my windows down. Suddenly, the truck pulled up beside me, and this giant of a man leaned out. Picture a bald, muscular gorilla in human form. He looked me dead in the eye and growled, "Hey asshole, if you ever flip me off again, I'll break your fingers and shove them somewhere you won't like." Now, I'm a regular guy, decently built and not easily scared, but this guy looked like he could bench press my entire car. For a split second, I genuinely thought I was about to meet my end, just one block away from work. Terrified, I quickly stammered out that the finger wasn't meant for him, it was for the poor woman who couldn't park. He stared at me, paused for what felt like forever, and then said, "Oh, never mind," before speeding off. I may or may not have peed myself just a little. These days, whenever I feel like flipping someone off, I keep my hands firmly out of sight. I was a writing tutor in college, and there was this tiny senior Vietnamese man named Nhatnam who would come to me for help with his English 101 writing assignments. He was a super nice, quiet man, militantly polite and humble. One day, they got a prompt along the lines of, "Write about a memory you will never forget." He handed me his essay to check over, and it was a 4-page description of how he used to crawl through tunnels and kill people. He described coating himself in mud so thick that he would blend into the walls. One story involved him silently moving through a room of sleeping soldiers and neutralizing each one. His writing was in a new English speaker's matter-of-fact tone, describing what it was like to confront people with a knife. For example, on Thursday, I took down 3 at the entrance, then the doctor and his patient, then the 4 youngsters in the big room, then I handled the radio man. They were eating, so I had some rice and fish. Then I took care of the two men at the back entrance. Then I left and rode my motorcycle to my mom's house, and we played cards. So, I, 42M, always pay to lock my gym bag in a locker every single day. The only time I ever remove it is after the gym/pool, when I take a shower. So the only time this could have happened was when I was in the shower, but I never saw him there today. The guy in question was not in the gym while I was there, nor was he in the pool or sauna during that time. I usually see him 1 to 3 times per week, as we frequently use the facilities around the same time, between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. Today he wasn't there, but about 1.5 hours after I got home from the gym, I got a knock at the door. It was the guy from the gym's buddy, someone I've never even met before, asking my wife if she had recently been to the gym. I was at the top of the stairs, and when I heard this, I yelled down, "Who is it?" The guy tells me his buddy left his stuff in my gym bag and needs it back. WTAF? Am I tripping, or is this absolutely bonkers? I asked the guy how the F he found my house. He says, because there's an air tag in there. I go to look in my bag, and lo and behold, there are 2 FN weed pens and a set of keys with an air tag. How and when did he do this? Like, what would you guys do, and how would that make you feel? I'm honestly feeling like I should just break the guy's face to teach him a lesson, but I don't want to end up in jail over this. IMO, this guy desperately needs to be taught a very valuable lesson about boundaries and privacy. When I was 16, I was walking to a store near my house. I was a huge pothead and would walk to the nearby neighborhood to get my stuff and then take a shortcut through that area to the store to buy blunt wraps. As I was walking through an abandoned apartment building, a very nicely dressed man walked by and asked how I was doing. I ignored him and kept walking. In that area, it was unusual to see a white man in a suit, so I was a bit thrown off. I got to the store, and on my way back, I noticed a white truck parked in the corner of the apartment building. Feeling uneasy, I decided to take the long way on the busy street instead. The truck drove up to me, and the same man jumped out and picked me up so fast that I didn't even have time to think. At the time, I was only 100 pounds and nowhere near as strong as him. I tried to scream and hit him with my elbow, but it was no use. Then, out of nowhere, a woman who was heavily on drugs and always walking around the city came running at us, yelling for him to put me down. Amazingly, he actually let me go and sped off. Almost 10 years later, I always stopped to give that woman food and recently paid for her to go to rehab. She's now doing great, reunited with her grandchildren, and working. It's not as creepy as some of the other stories out there, but I definitely never walked alone again after that. So I, 18F, work at a bakery, and it's not often we get creepy customers, but the other day I had an unsettling experience. I was working the register when an older man walked in. As usual, I greeted him with, "Hi, welcome in. How are you?" He didn't look at me or acknowledge what I said. Instead, he immediately pointed to a cookie and asked what flavor it was. I told him the name, and then he asked what was in it. As I started listing the ingredients, he cut me off abruptly and said, "Stop," in a frustrated tone. That's when he finally looked at me. He leaned over the counter until his face was about a foot away from mine and said, "Wow, you are a really pretty girl. You're so attractive, you know that, right?" Feeling uncomfortable, I just said, "Thanks," in a monotone voice and looked down at the ordering screen. It got worse. He then said, "You must get that a lot, don't you? That you're so beautiful." I awkwardly replied, No, not really." He responded, "Oh, well, you're such a beautiful girl. How old are you, anyway?" 14, 15. "Surely you're 15, eh?" At that point, my gut was screaming that something was very wrong. I looked up at him and coldly said, "No, I'm an adult." His body language got all antsy, and he asked, "But what age?" I replied, "An adult," because I didn't trust him knowing my exact age. He could already see my name on my name tag, and the thought of him knowing that, plus where I worked, made me nervous. He shook his head like he was disappointed and said, "Okay, well, you're just really attractive. I hope you know that." I said, "Okay," and then he ordered really quickly and left. After he left, we noticed his full name had been saved on the register from his credit card. My coworker and I decided to look up his name, along with our town, on a registered sex offender database. Sure enough, he had a criminal record on there, which made me feel sick to my stomach about the whole interaction.